We have written questions, and then we have questions as well. Okay. Questions from the next room over, from the overflow room, and I guess we can start with those. Mr. Chomsky, please describe briefly the difference between Judaism and Zionism. Between Judaism and Zionism.
My grandfather was an ultra-Orthodox Jew. He lived in Baltimore most of his life, but I think he still thought he was in the Ukraine, frankly. He was wondering why the peasants were black. Transplanted Eastern European Jewry, fled from Eastern Europe during the pogroms in the early part of the last century. He wasn't a Zionist, Zionist. In fact, you go back to, say, the First World War, I think maybe 1% of the Jewish population of the world had what's called a shekel, a Zionist membership in the Zionist organization. The United States, here, most of the population, the Jewish population, was sort of pro-Zionist in a sort of interesting sense. So, for example, Louis Brandeis was one of the great heroes of the Zionist movement, great humanist, an important legal figure. He was very much in favor of the Balfour Declaration, but the reasons are that he felt that the Balfour Declaration would direct Eastern European Jews to Palestine, so they wouldn't come here. And he didn't want these very Eastern European Jews, like my parents, for example, to come to the United States, where there was an elite Jewish community. We don't want those guys. And that continues. It was Zionist in that sense. So that continued after the Second World War. It's not discussed very much, but one of the really ugly periods, which I'm old enough to remember very well, as an activist at that time. After the Second World War, the death camps ended, so no crematoria. But plenty of people were living in, the Jews were living in the concentration camps under horrible conditions. Actually, Truman actually sent an emissary to inspect the conditions. His reports were awful. Well, very few of those people came here. And they didn't come here for a couple of reasons. The one reason is the American Jewish community didn't want them. They wanted them to go to Palestine, not here. And there were a lot of reasons for that. The one reason was there was anti-Semitism at the time. I grew up with it, and they didn't want more of it. And another is, they're the kind of people we want around here in our community. So yeah, they were Zionists in that sense, send them to Palestine. And that was considered extremely humane. It was very humane to get them to go to Palestine, somebody else's country, but not bring them here. Would they have wanted to come here? Well, we don't really know, but half of Europe would have wanted to come here in those days if they had a chance. And I don't doubt that people in miserable conditions in concentration camps would. In fact, probably more Latvian Nazis got here in the late 40s than Jews from the concentration camps. So yes, they were Zionists in that sense. But until 1967, Zionism was not a huge issue in the Jewish community. In fact, journals like, say, Commentary, ultra extreme jingoist pro-Israel journal. Until 1967, it was mostly non-Zionist. Norman Podhoretz, the editor who's now extreme, he wrote a book and came out in 1967. He mentioned Israel in his own history. And it was that way across the board. It just wasn't much of an issue. In 1967, it changed. A lot of reasons. One of them was what I mentioned, but there's more. So now, yes, now it's true that for a large part of the Jewish community, Zionism is like the religion. But it's new, and it's thin, and it's limited. And among younger Jews, it's actually disappearing. I think seriously declining. And the Zionist leaders are concerned about it. Polls and so on show that. And just the normal liberal attitudes of young Jews are not consistent with what's going on there. But they're different. You can be First of all, you can be a non-Jewish Zionist. Christian Zionism is way older than Jewish Zionism and much deeper. We tend to forget that, but Christian Zionism in Britain and the United States particularly was a very powerful force, very powerful. But remember, these are very religious societies. The United States in particular, but Britain too, they are really fundamentalist societies. Like in the United States, about a third of the population believes that every word of the Bible is literally true. That's why, and like 2/3 are expecting the second coming, and that's why half the population thinks the world was created a couple thousand years ago, exactly the way it is now. And why, one of the heads of the subcommittees in Congress just announced that we don't have to worry about global warming because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. It's really funny what's happening in some small, insignificant country, but not the richest, most powerful country in the world. About a quarter of Republicans think Obama's Antichrist. Off the wall. And it's been that way a long time. And it's not Christian. It's not the Christian right. It's not just evangelicals. It's the mainstream. The people like Woodrow Wilson, for example. So, for example, when the British General Allenby conquered Jerusalem during the First World War, if you look at the headlines of the national press, like Washington Post, they were saying that Richard the Lionhearted finally drove the pagans out of the Holy Land. Allenby's Richard the Lionhearted drove out the pagans, brought the Holy Land back to us. That's the liberal mainstream. And of course, the Holy Book says after the Holy Land comes back to us, God's commandment is that the Jews have to go there. Harold Ickes, who was one of Roosevelt's main advisors, liberal, secular advisor, described the return of the Jews to Palestine then as one of the greatest achievements of history, because it was fulfilling God's will. And that goes right to the present. Well, that's Christian Zionism. A large part of the reason why the connection between Israel and the United States, Britain too. So you can be a Christian Zionist, you can be a Jewish non-Zionist. I mean, or anti-Zionist. Those are different notions.
Question? Question. What implications does the death of bin Laden have on the issue of Palestine? What does it mean to the resistance to the occupation?
Practically nothing. Bin Laden didn't amount to anything. He amounted to a lot in the American imagination, demonology, but he almost nothing to do with what's going on in the world. He was hidden away somewhere in Afghanistan, Pakistan actually. Whatever Al-Qaeda is, it isn't a membership organization where you take orders from the top. It's called, specialists who work on it call it a network of networks, kind of loosely affiliated groups, mostly local, independent.
Run by the CIA and Mossad, it appears. Run by the CIA and Mossad, it appears.
It's not run by the CIA.
From the top down.
But they're all over. They're pretty well studied. They're very good book by Scott Adrian, who's a lot of them are just based on communities. Same soccer club, things like that. And they carry out their own operations. Bin Laden was a kind of symbolic figure, so people listen to his orations and so on. But and besides, increasingly they were becoming marginalized. What happened in the last year or so, it sort of almost totally marginalized them. But what's going on in the Arab Spring is really significant. And there's it essentially drove what there is of jihadism into the corner. Nobody cares about it anymore. Why the United States decided to assassinate him at this point, and it wasn't an assassination, remember. They've now conceded it was a straight murder of an unarmed, defenseless man. They didn't try to capture him. Take a look at the details. They almost certainly could have. but they didn't want to capture him. They dumped him in the ocean so that nobody would find out what happened to him. This is all internal to U.S. ideology. It has nothing much to what's going on in the world. The chances are they didn't want to capture him, because if they did, they'd have had to bring him to trial, and that would have been a disaster, because they really had no evidence. And they've conceded it a long time ago. Years ago, the FBI conceded that they basically had suspicions and the beliefs are probably correct, but beliefs that are probably correct don't stand up in court. But they had no evidence, and so it's best to murder him and get rid of him and have celebrations in Times Square. But I think it has almost nothing to do with what's going on.
So, unity between Hamas and Fatah is a positive step, but now, how far can it go, given the revelations of the leaked Palestine papers?
There's a lot of talk about the Palestine papers. I wasn't that impressed myself. I thought we mostly knew everything that was in there. What the Palestine papers showed was that the Palestine Authority was, almost desperate to get anything. They were offered nothing, and they kept pushing, well, give us this, give us that. They were treated with total contempt by Israel and by the United States. So you read the statements of Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton, they're just kind of contemptuous. What are you guys bothering us for? But that we knew, that's normal imperialist racism. So it showed up here too. Others disagree, but I wasn't. That's one of the reasons I never wrote about it. I don't think they meant much.
And now we'll be taking questions from the audience. We don't have too much time, so if you have a question. I started for a while, so I'm projecting.
What's Israel's stand on the no-fly zone over Libya?
Over Libya?
Yeah.
Well, they would go along with, what's Israel's stance on the no-fly zone over Libya? They would go along with the U.S. on this. They don't like Gaddafi. In fact, notice it's not a no-fly zone. We should be careful about that. The UN did call for a no-fly zone, but there are 3 countries who are implementing it as token participation by others. But it's basically Britain, France, and the United States. That's the 3 traditional imperial powers. The imperial triumvirate picked up the wording of the no-fly zone, appealed to the fact that the Arab League asked for it. The Arab League was immediately back down when they saw what they're doing. And they immediately interpreted it as a justification for participation on the rebel side. You can say that's right, you can say it's wrong, you can say what you like, but it wasn't a no-fly zone. So there was a ceasefire imposed on the government, but not imposed on the rebels. And so when the rebels broke out of Benghazi and moved to the west and took Brega and other towns, they were backed by NATO. So no no-fly zone. But the participation on the side of the rebels, Israel was probably more or less going along with them. They probably don't care that much.
Also, can we also keep all questions from here on out related to Israel and Palestine, to the topic at hand? And we will be taking 2 more questions. I know you had your hand up, so you can go ahead.
What similarities do you see between what's going on in Palestine and what's going on in Kashmir?
What similarities do you see about what's going on in Palestine parallel to what's going on in Kashmir?
If any.
Kashmir is probably the most militarized part of the world. A huge Indian army there, very brutal, very repressive. On the other side, Pakistan has been carrying out its own terrorist activities. But the contested parts of Kashmir, the ones under Indian control, are very brutally handled. Long history. It goes back to partition. At the time of partition, Britain divided the countries. Kashmir was mostly Muslim, but it had a Hindu prince who was running it. And the UN had called for a referendum, which would have voted either for independence or for joining Pakistan. India wouldn't allow it, so they never had a referendum. They kind of controlled it fairly